The rain had been soft and steady all morning, streaking the front windows of willow and stem with thin gray lines. Mara Shaw ran her fingers along the cool edge of a wooden workbench, trimming back the stems of fresh ranunculus and brushing loose petals into a wicker basket beneath the table. 7 years had settled into this space like a gentle fog, quiet and predictable. She'd cut her long dark hair the day she left the Hales, swapped her old last name back to Shaw, dumped the phone number they'd used to track her every move, and driven north until the highway signs felt unfamiliar. The Hales had laughed behind her back, certain she would fold without their money and connections, convinced she would end up homeless, begging for scraps before the year was out. But here she stayed, tending flowers, paying rent on time, keeping her world small and safe. The bell above the shop door jingled shortly after 1 o'clock. Mara didn't look up right away, used to wandering customers pausing to peer at bouquets through the misted glass. She set down her floral shears and wiped damp soil off her apron before turning to greet whoever had stepped inside. The man wore a well-tailored charcoal suit, crisp at the cuffs, leather shoes polished even through the wet sidewalk. In his hands, he cradled a terracotta pot holding bellflowers, their pale purple blooms limp and gray at the edges, stems drooping as if they'd given up entirely. "Excuse me," he said, and that voice hit Mara like cold rain to the chest. She froze mid-breath, every quiet routine of the last 7 years fraying at the edges. When their eyes locked, his own widened sharply, shock flooding his face, mouth parting without scent. It was Lincoln, the boy who once leaned against the dining room doorway and sneered that she would never amount to anything without his family's charity. The man who watched silently while his parents took the money her mother had left behind. Mara's fingers curled tight into the fabric of her apron, fighting the instinct to step back. She'd spent years imagining what she would say if she ever saw any of them, and now all those prepared words vanished completely. "I didn't expect to find you," Lincoln said eventually, his voice lower, rougher than she remembered. He shifted the flower pot slightly, as if it suddenly felt heavy in his grip. "I was told this shop had the best plant specialist within 50 miles. These bellflowers, they've been fading for weeks. No gardener I've hired can bring." Mara glanced down at the wilted blooms, recognition pricking at memory. Elaine Hale had loved bellflowers, grown them every summer in the backyard garden of the big suburban house Mara had. For 8, old memories flooded. Long summer afternoons weeding that garden alone while the rest of the family sat inside drinking tea. Lincoln laughing with his friends and ignoring her. "I don't take every rest job," Mara replied, keeping her tone flat, neutral, careful not to reveal how shaky she was. She moved behind the counter, putting solid plants sometimes caved. "There's only so much to do." Lincoln's closer, the soles of his shoes squeaking faintly against the wet hardwood floor. He set the pot down gently on the counter between them, his gaze never leaving her face. "This matters. More than I can explain right now. My mother's health hasn't been good, and these words. I've thing." Mara studied his expression, searching for the familiar, mocking amusement she knew so well. It wasn't there. Instead, she saw exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes, tension tight across his jaw. Still didn't trust it. The Hales were masters at wearing whatever face. "You found me after 7 years," Mara said quietly. "Why now? Why over a pot buying flowers?" Lincoln hesitated, glancing toward the shop window where rain continued to fall. But her. "I didn't track you down for fun. I truly came here about the bellflowers. But I won't lie, finding you changes things. My mother doesn't have much time left. Been asking for you." The sentence hung thick in damp air between them. Mara's chest tightened. For 7 years, she'd built a life where the Hales existed only old nightmares, sealed away behind locked doors, changed identities. Now Lincoln stood in her flower shop, bringing the pack straight to her counter, and there was no easy way. She stared at wilted bellflowers. Lincoln. The safe, quiet bubble she'd worked so hard to build had just cracked open. Understood immediately. Nothing would stay this visit. Before she could answer him, Lincoln leaned forward slightly, his voice. "She wants to talk, before it's too late, and I think you need to hear what she has to say." The quiet hum of the central air conditioner seemed to amplify after Elaine's whispered confession. Mara's gaze darted toward Robert, who stood rigid in the living room doorway, his jaw clamped tight, as if he'd heard every word his wife had just spoken. Elaine sank back against the cushions of her armchair, her thin shoulders rising and falling with shallow breaths, as though she'd spent the last of her energy on that single warning. Lincoln, who had lingered near the hallway, glanced between his father and Mara, confusion clouding his face. He had not caught the quiet exchange, and Robert quickly stepped forward to redirect the conversation, masking his sharp irritation with a practiced, composed tone. "Elaine tires easily," Robert said. "This visit should draw to a close soon. Lincoln, walk Mara out. Mara wanted to press for more details, to ask exactly what documents she should look for and what they proved, but she could feel Robert's eyes boring into her. She forced herself to nod politely and rise from the chair. On the short walk to the front door, Lincoln fell into step beside her, his voice low. I appreciate you coming today. I know this wasn't easy. Mara glanced at him, weighing whether she could trust him with Elaine's secret. He had shared partial information about the inheritance before, but he had left out critical pieces, and she could not shake the suspicion he was still shielding his father. She chose caution. Your mother said something confusing just now, about paperwork that belonged to my mother. Lincoln's pace slowed, and he glanced over his shoulder to make sure they were out of Robert's earshot. I know about the fund. I tried to get Dad to release them to you years ago, after you left. He said the money covered room and board during the years you stayed with us. That explanation matched what Mara had always suspected, yet it felt incomplete. Elaine's urgent warning implied there was proof Robert had never had the legal right to take the money in the first place. Is that all there is to it? Mara. Lincoln hesitated, and that small pause was enough to stoke her distrust. I don't have access to his private desk files. He keeps that area. Mara did not push further. She thanked him for the effort, climbed into her car, and drove away from the Hale estate, her mind racing. That evening, she met Lila at the cafe again and relayed everything Elaine had whispered, along with Lincoln's guarded receipt. Lila frowned, wiping her hands on her apron as she leaned across the... Maybe Lincoln genuinely wants help. He looked uncomfortable back when his father confronted you outside. Or he's telling me just enough to keep me compliant, Mara countered. He's grown up under Robertson's. His loyalty will always lean toward his family. The disagreement hung heavy. Lila believed Mara was writing Lincoln off too quickly, while Mara insisted trusting any Hale would be. For the first time in 7 years, a thin crack formed in their otherwise unshakable. Over the next days, Mara could not stop thinking about the locked bottom drawer in Robert's. She weighed the risk of returning house, knowing Robert would never willingly let her look through his private. An opportunity unexpectedly opened when Lynn called and said Elaine had asked if Mara would come over again to help tend the backyard bellflowers. Mara, planning to use the visit to search for the documents while the rest of the family was occupied elsewhere. When she arrived, Robert was in his home office attending a virtual work call with the door partially closed. Lincoln stayed outside with Elaine in the garden, giving Mara a window of time to slip in. The heavy wooden desk sat against her. She knelt down, running her fingers along the bottom drawer, and found it secured with a small comma. After several tries, she guessed the passcode using the year Elaine and Robert married, and the drawer. Inside, tucked beneath old records, was a faded folder holding her mother's papers, clearly stating the inheritance was meant exclusively for Mara. Once she turned, the Hales had moved the funds into their family account for her birthday, with no signed comma. Her blood ran cold as she pulled out her phone to take photos, only to freeze when she heard footsteps behind her. Robert stood in the doorway, his face anger. What do you think you're doing in here? Mara stood slowly, clutching her phone in one hand. I'm looking for... Robert stepped forward, blocking the doorway so It's private property. You have no right to go through my files. If you attempt to use anything you found today, I will file a trespassing complaint. The threat hung thick in the air. Mara knew she had proof, but Rob ready to fight, and she was suddenly aware how alone she might be in this battle. Mara stared across the counter at Lincoln, every muscle in her shoulders coiled tight. The hum of the shop's small space heater filled the pause between them, mixing with the soft patter of rain against the glass. She shook her head slowly, stepping back until her hips bumped the wooden shelf lined with potted succulents. I can't do this, she told him. Whatever your mother wants to say, it doesn't concern me anymore. I left that family 7 years ago, and I'm not going back. Lincoln's shoulders slumped, his hand brushing the edge of the terracotta pot holding the wilted bellflowers. He didn't push right away, his gaze drifting over the shop, taking in the hand-painted signs, the woven hanging baskets, the framed photos of local gardens taped to the back wall. Mara wondered what he saw, whether he still thought this small, modest life was pitiful compared to the sprawling Hale estate. I'm not asking you to move back, Lincoln said, his tone measured. Just to look at the flowers. If you can help them survive, that's all I'm requesting today. The rest, you can decide later. Mara hesitated. A lifetime of caring for plants had taught her to recognize when something was still clinging to life, and those bellflowers hadn't fully surrendered yet. Even so, every instinct screamed to turn him away, to send him out the door and lock it behind him. She crossed her arms over her chest. I'll examine them. That's it. No conversations about your family, No arrangements to visit anyone? Once I tell you if they can be saved, you leave. Lincoln nodded, agreeing to her terms without argument. Mara leaned forward, carefully lifting one limp stem between her thumb and forefinger, checking the condition of the roots peeking through the drainage hole. She noted the overwatered soil, the lack of proper drainage, signs someone had panicked and overcompensated in a desperate attempt to keep the blooms alive. She explained what the plant needed in short, clipped sentences, keeping all emotion out of her voice. When he finally picked up the pot to leave, he paused at the door. I'll come back tomorrow to hear your full recommendation. Mara didn't respond, just watched him step out into the gray room. The bell jingled once more as the door shut, and the shop fell quiet. But the peace felt fractured now, fragile. She locked the front door an hour, flipped the closed sign on, and walked 2 blocks down to Lila's cabin. The warm scent of roasted coffee and fresh blueberry muffins wrapped around her as she stepped in. Lila looked up from wiping down the counter and immediately noticed Mara's tense face. She gestured toward a small booth in the back corner, away from other customers. Okay, Lila said once they sat down, sliding a steaming mug of herbal tea across the table. Something terrible. You never close early unless you're... Mara told her. Lincoln walking into the flower shop, the bellflowers, the mention of Elaine being terminally ill and asking... Lila's expression darkened as she listened. I knew this day might come eventually, Lila said. Do you think he's telling the truth about Mom? Or is this some scheme to pull you back into the... I don't know, Mara admitted, staring at tea. Part of me wants to believe he's just desperate for his mother. The rest remembers how easily the Hales lie when it... The next afternoon arrived, and Lincoln returned right... Mara laid out a detailed care plan for the bellflowers, listing new soil, limited water, shaded outdoor placement. She kept every interaction strictly professional, refusing to entertain any personal questions he tried. He left without further, but Mara couldn't shake the feeling he wouldn't give up. Mara thought Lincoln might accept her boundaries here, until she spotted the sleek black luxury sedan parked across the street as she finished locking up the shop at dusk. The windows were tinted, but she recognized the shape of the car immediately. The Hales had always driven vehicles that stood out in this neighborhood. Dropped. Lincoln. A few minutes later, Lincoln called her cell phone. A number. She stared at the screen, her He'd found her private contact info. She answered the call. Breath. Mara, Lincoln said, his voice tight with stress. My father knows I found you. He's in the car with me right now. Mara stepped back against the wall of her shop, eyes fixed on the dark sedan across. The quiet, separate life she'd built for 7 years was no longer hers to keep hidden. Robert had tracked her down, and there was no escaping the confronting for her. Mara held Robert's stare, her thumb hovering over the screen of her phone, where the photos of the trust documents were saved. She did not move, did not reach for the folder again, careful not to give him any excuse to grab her device. I came into this house with your permission, she said evenly. You invited me to tend the garden for Elaine. I did not break in. Robert's lips pressed into a thin, bitter line. Permission to walk the grounds and speak with my wife is not permission to rummage through my private office files. You know how this will look to law enforcement. Mara's pulse thundered in her ears, but she forced herself to stay calm. She understood his threat. A trespassing report could complicate any future legal claim over the inheritance, even if the underlying record supported her. She slowly slid her phone into the pocket of her jacket, keeping it secured out of his reach. I'm leaving, she told him, and we can discuss this through legal channels from now on. Robert stepped aside just enough to let her pass, his eyes never leaving hers. She walked through the hallway and out the front door without stopping to speak with Lincoln or Elaine in the garden. She climbed into her car, locked the doors, and pulled onto the road, not exhaling fully until the Hale neighborhood faded in her rearview mirror. That night, Mara researched local estate attorneys online and scheduled a consultation with a family lawyer specializing in trust disputes. She brought the saved photos of the paperwork to the meeting 3 days later. The attorney reviewed the images carefully, explaining that the documents proved the inheritance was designated solely for Mara, and the Hales had transferred the funds without her consent. Still, he warned her the case would not be quick. Robert had the money to drag proceedings out for months. A day after the consultation, Lincoln showed up at Mara's flower shop after closing. He did not bring the bellflower, and his expression was heavy with... He asked if they could talk somewhere quiet, and Mara agreed to walk with him to a park bench a few blocks. Lincoln admitted he had known about the trust paperwork for years. He had tried to convince Robert to return the money when Mara turned 25, but his father had shut him down, warning him not to meddle in family finance. Lincoln had lacked the courage to push further at them. afraid of losing his place in the family business. I didn't realize Dad had moved the funds before your birth, Lincoln said quickly. I thought the money was just being held temporarily until you settled down. I was naive. Mara absorbed his confession, her old suspicion softening, though she did not fully trust yet. Before they could talk more, Lincoln's phone buzzed with a text from. She wanted Mara to visit the house one more time. Mara hated, then accepted the invitation. When she arrived the next afternoon, Elaine was sitting in the sunroom overlooking the backyard and the bellflower beds visible through the glass. Robert was away for a business meeting, leaving them Elaine told Mara she intended to amend her will before died, to acknowledge the stolen inheritance and help Mara recover the. I can sign a sworn statement for you, Elaine said, her voice thin but firm. Robert cannot stop me from telling. Hope stirred in Mara's chest for the first time since Lincoln had walked in. It felt as though justice might actually be within reach. But the glass door to the sunroom slid open, warning. Robert stood in the doorway, having returned early, and he had heard. His gaze Elaine, Mara, cold. You will not amend. Robert to his wife, and you will not give any statements to Mara or attorney. This family's finances are private. Elaine lifted her chin, refusing to back down. It is my right to do what I. Robert turned toward Mara, his sharp. My property. If you set foot here again without a formal court order, I will follow through on aid. Mara stood slowly. The small window of opportunity Elaine had offered was closed. She understood now that Robert would fight this every front, and Elaine's fragile health might not hold long enough to make the sworn. The stakes had grown higher than imagined. Mara's grip on her phone tightened until her knuckles ached, rain misting her cheeks as she stood beside the shop's brick exterior. She glanced again at the black sedan idling across the street, its tinted windows hiding whoever sat inside. The familiar cold weight of old dread settled low in her chest. The same feeling she'd carried every time Robert Hale called her into his study for a lecture years ago. I don't want to speak with him, she said flatly into the phone. You knew better than to bring him here. Lincoln sighed on the other end, frustration clear in his tone. I didn't have a choice. Once Dad found out I'd located you, he insisted on coming. He won't leave until he talks to you. Mara considered rushing back inside, bolting the door and ignoring them completely. But she knew Robert well enough to guess what would follow. Repeated visits, calls to her landlord, quiet pressure on the small community that supported her flower shop. Running again would only let them dictate the terms. She swallowed hard. Tell him he can come over here alone. Lincoln, you stay in the car. If anyone else steps out, I'm walking away, and I won't discuss anything ever again. There was a long pause before Lincoln agreed. Mara ended the call and waited, arms folded against the evening chill. A minute later, the sedan's passenger door opened. Robert Hale stepped out, wearing a tailored navy blazer, silver hair neatly combed, his posture stiff and imposing even from a distance. He crossed the wet street slowly, eyes locked directly on Mara, he said once he reached the sidewalk, his voice deep and unyielding. It has been a very long 7 years, Mara replied, keeping her gaze. What do you want, mister? Robert's mouth tightened at her formal address. You owe our family gratitude. We took you in when you had nowhere else to go, gave you shelter and food after your mother passed, and you left without word, cut off every connection. Now my son finds you living comfortably, running your own business, and you refuse even a simple favor for. Mara let out a quiet. She had rehearsed this conversation countless nights and now the words came easily, calm and I worked for that shelter, food. I cleaned the house, tended the gardens, ran errands every single day with no pay. That debt was settled long before I left. Robert's jaw tightened. You're being grateful. Elaine is dying. All she asks is. I was told the request was about bears. Mara reminded him. I gave Lincoln instructions to save them. That is the only favor I am willing. Those flowers mean nothing next to my wife's fish. Robert countered, stepping closer. Come to the house once. Speak with her, and we will leave you in. Mara hesitated. If she refused outright, Robert might retaliate immediately against her shop. If she agreed, she would step back into the home that had felt like a cage for nearly a decade. She negotiated a strict terms. She would visit for 1 hour only, no arguments, demands, and the family would not show up at her shop or contact her without prior written notice. Robert agreed, though his smile never left his eyes. They arranged the visit for 2 days later. When Robert turned and walked to the sedan, Mara remained standing on the sidewalk until they. She texted Lila that night, explaining what to do. Lila begged her not to go, warning that the Hales would twist any agreement. but Mara had already signed. On the morning of the visit, dressed simply, tucked a small note into her purse, and drove toward the upscale suburban neighborhood where they lived. The large 2-story home looked identical. She remembered it. White siding, sprawling green lawn, the backyard garden where Elaine once grew roses. Lincoln met her at the front door and guided her quietly. The air smelled of lemon polish and precision. Elaine sat in an armchair in the living room window, wrapped in a soft-knit blanket, her face thinner and paled. Their eyes met. Elaine lifted one trembling hand and patted the inside her. Mara smiled cautiously, keeping them. Before anyone else could speak, Elaine leaned forward, her voice above a whisper, meant only his ears. They never told you the whole truth about your mother's money. Robert hid documents in his old desk drawer. You need to. I'm gone. Mara froze, her heart roaring in her ears. Robert, standing in the doorway behind them, shifted sharply, his eyes dark. The secret Elaine had just changed everything, and Mara understood she had stumbled onto something the Hale patriarch would do anything to protect. Mara walked to her car with tight, deliberate steps, the weight of Robert's final warning clinging to her shoulders. She did not glance back at the sunroom windows, afraid she would see Elaine's defeated expression staring after her. Once inside the driver's seat, she rested her forehead against the cool steering wheel for a long breath, trying to quiet the panic rising in her throat. She had proof of the stolen inheritance, but without Elaine's formal sworn statement, her case was far weaker. By the next morning, Robert had already struck back. Mara received an email from her commercial property landlord, copied to her business inbox. The message listed vague complaints about excess outdoor plant debris, drawing pests and disturbing neighboring storefronts, threatening to terminate her lease if she failed to remedy the issues within 10 days. Mara's stomach sank. She maintained the shop exterior meticulously. There were no valid grounds for the warning. This was retaliation. She called Lila immediately and explained what had happened. Leela offered to speak with other local business owners to confirm Mara had never caused neighborhood problems, but even with witness support, fighting a lease dispute would cost time and money she could barely spare. Mara's savings were built for flower inventory and emergency repairs, not legal battles against a wealthy man willing to bend rules to pressure her. Lincoln called later that same afternoon, but Mara let the call go to voicemail. She did not want to hear excuses, and she feared any conversation with him could be used against her later. 2 days passed before he showed up at the shop during open hour, waiting patiently by the front counter until she finished helping a customer. I need to talk to you, Lincoln said once they were alone. His face looked worn, defeated. Dad gave me an ultimatum. If I keep helping you or speaking to you, he will remove me from the family company and cut me out of the will entirely. Mara studied him carefully, recognizing the familiar conflict between his conscience and his loyalty to his father. She waited for him to say he would stand, but the words never. I can't risk losing everything, Lincoln admitted quietly. I have to step. The betrayal stung deeper than Mara expected. She had started to believe he might choose the truth over his family, and now she found herself isolated. She nodded, telling him she understood, though her tone held no. Lincoln hesitated for another moment before turning and walking out. Mara sat alone in her small apartment above shop, sorting through legal papers and going over her limited options. She could drop the claim and keep this, surrendering the money her mother had, or she could push forward, risking the flower shop, her home, and the quiet 7 years of peace she had fought so hard to build. For hours, she replayed old memories, scrubbing floors late at the night, eating leftover meals after the Hale family dinner, watching them take what her mother had intended only. She could not bring herself to let Rob. The next morning, she called her attorney and told him she wanted to move forward with filing the civil claim over the. There would be costs, delays, back, but she was no longer willing to hide. She would fight for what was. 3 days after the decision, her phone rang late. The caller ID was familiar, but when she answered, she heard Elaine's soft, strained voice. In the hospital. My oxygen levels dropped suddenly this afternoon. Robert is not here right now, and I don't know how much time I have before he returns. You need to come alone. I have physical proof I cannot hide. Documents locked in my hospital safe. Mara gripped the phone tightly, aware of the enormous risk. If Robert arrived while she was in hospital, he would accuse her of harassing his sick wife. Still, this might be her only chance to secure the evidence that would win her case. She grabbed her purse for the door, unsure what she would find once she reached her. Mara grabbed her jacket and locked the shop's back door behind her, her keys jangling nervously in her palm as she hurried toward her car. The sun had already dipped below the rooftops, painting the sky in muted purple and gray. She pulled up the hospital's address on her phone, double-checking directions, and reminded herself to leave a note for Lila in case she did not return quickly. She trusted Elaine's plea, but she could not ignore the possibility that Robert might somehow learn of this meeting and intercept her. The drive to the regional medical center took 20 minutes. The parking garage was half empty this late, and she found a spot near the main entrance. Inside, the lobby hummed with quiet hospital noise, rolling carts, distant page announcements, the soft rustle of staff scrubs. She checked in at the front desk and asked for Elaine Hale's room number, noting the ward was restricted to immediate family visitors after 8 p.m. The nurse behind the desk hesitated before confirming the room. Mrs. Hale listed only her husband and son as approved visitors. "I'll have to call up to the room to confirm she is expecting you." Mara's throat tightened. She waited while the nurse dialed the extension, relieved when a moment later she received permission to go up. She rode the elevator alone to the 3rd floor, her reflection blurred in the metal walls, every floor number lighting up one by one. When she reached Elaine's private room, the door was cracked open and in. Elaine lay propped up on hospital pillows, an oxygen tube looping around her ears, her skin pale and thin. A small canvas folder rested on the tray beside her bed. She gestured for Mara to close the door gently once she stepped inside. "I don't have long," Elaine whispered, her breath shallow. "Robert left to pick up dinner, but he will be back soon." Inside this folder are original bank transfer slips and a signed witness statement from my old financial advisor. "He watched Robert move your mother's trust funds into the Hale family account the week before your 25th birthday." Mara sat carefully on the edge of the visitor chair and took the folder, slowly opening it to scan the paper. The documents matched the photos she had taken in Robert's desk, but these were original signed copies, far stronger evidence for court. She slid them into her, making sure they were fully zipped. Mara said quietly, "This changes everything." Elaine gave a faint, tired "I should have stopped him, I was afraid of what breaking the family apart would mean for Lincoln and our business. I let fear make me..." Before they could speak further, a soft knock came at the door. Mara tensed, ready for Robert to walk in, but it was Lincoln. He paused in the doorway, surprised to find Mara, then stepped inside and closed the door. He had come to check on his mother after his father texted him about the sudden hospital. Lincoln saw the hospital folder on, and he quickly put together what... For a long moment, no spoke. Then he turned, his voice, the earlier fear of being cut out of the family. "I know what my father did. I can testify to everything I've seen over the years. I won't stay silent." Mara studied his face, looking for him. Found none. Lincoln had made a choice. Together, they discussed how to submit the original documents to Mara's attorney first. Lincoln agreed to schedule a formal recorded statement with... Their conversation cut short when Elaine's monitor briefly, and she closed her eyes. Mara knew she needed to leave before returned. She gave Elaine a quiet nod of thanks, then followed Lincoln out. They parted ways near elevators, agreeing to communicate only through secure text messages to avoid Robert The next business day, Mara delivered the original bank slips and witness statement to her attorney. Her legal team reviewed the full packet and prepared to file the civil complaint officially against the Hale estate to recover the stolen inheritance. The paperwork was submitted. By late afternoon, Robert received note. Lincoln called Mara an hour later, voice tight. "He got the court papers. He's furious. He says he will fight every step, drag your reputation through depositions and hearings, and make this process as painful as..." Mara leaned back against the wall of our shop, staring out at the potted blooms lining. For the first time since Lincoln walked into her shop with wilted bellflowers, afraid. She held the proof, and Lincoln was willing her. The power beginning to shift. The days after the lawsuit was filed moved at a frantic, unsteady pace. Mara's attorney exchanged formal letters with Robert's legal team, setting ground rules for pre-litigation negotiations. Robert's lawyer reached out within a week, offering a settlement package, and scheduled a meeting to review the terms. Mara brought Lila as a support person, while Lincoln agreed to stay away from the conference room to avoid giving Robert ammunition to claim collusion. When Mara opened the settlement document at the attorney's office, she scanned the fine print carefully. Robert was willing to pay a fraction of the stolen inheritance, but the contract demanded she sign a permanent non-disclosure agreement. She would have to promise never to speak publicly about what the Hales had done, never contact any member of the family again, and drop all legal claims with prejudice. If she broke any clause, she would owe the Hales steep financial penalties. Leela leaned in and whispered that the partial payout might be tempting, a quick end to the stress threatening Mara's flower shop, but Mara shook her head. Accepting those terms meant surrendering the truth. letting Robert bury his wrongdoing with money. The point was not only to recover funds from her mother, it was to refuse being silenced once more. "I reject this settlement," Mara told Robert's attorney plainly. "I want the full inheritance and no gag order. I will resolve this through mediation." Word traveled fast to Robert Hale. 2 days later, Lincoln called Mara with a warning. His father had dug up old handwritten notes Mara had scribbled as a teenager, messy journal entries where she wrote about leaving the Hale home one day. Robert planned to frame those pages as proof Mara had voluntarily abandoned any claim to the household and any family assets long before she turned 25. "He's saying those notes prove you walked away from any support, that you forfeited your mother's inheritance by choice," Lincoln explained, his tone. "He's prepared to submit them as evidence during mediation." Mara's attorney reviewed the information and explained the notes held little legal weight on their own. Still, they could create confusion for the meter, casting Mara as bitter and ungrateful instead of... Robert was pulling out every leverage point Lincoln promised to dig through old files at the family office that weekend, searching for anything that could counter his father's... On Sunday evening, he called Mara with critical news. The journal entries Robert planned to use were not the original. Robert had copied select lines onto Fresher, cutting out sentences that showed Mara had written those words while being pressured and over. The full original notebooks were still stored in a locked storage unit the Hales rented. Lincoln drove out to the facility that night, unlocked the storage space, and found the complete. He photographed every page, highlighting the omitted paragraphs that told the full story, and sent the files directly to Mara. The forged excerpts lost nearly all their persuasive power. The balance of evidence had fully tipped in Mara's favor. As they finalized materials for the upcoming mediation, Lincoln shared grim updates about Elaine. Her lung disease had worsened rapidly. Her doctors warned that her condition could deteriorate with... She might not live long enough to give a formal witness statement. Mara's chest ached. Elaine's testimony would strengthen her case, but no one could predict how much remained. She visited Elaine briefly at the hospital, following strict visitor rules and coordinating times when Robert would... Elaine remained calm, telling Mara she trusted Lincoln and the paperwork they had... The night before mediation would begin, Mara stayed late at the flower shop, arranging bouquets and trimming stems to steady her nerves. Rain tapped against the window once again, mirroring the day Lincoln first walked in with wilted bellflowers. She thought about everything had risked, her pet routine, her business, the safety she had built. She was no longer running. Her phone lit up with a Lincoln. Elaine's vital signs dropped sharply earlier that evening. The medical team was closely monitoring her overnight. No one knew if she would be conscious to join the mediation hearing scheduled. Mara stared at the message, a cold knot in her stomach. Even with forged evidence exposed and original journals secured, Elaine's testimony could be. If Elaine slipped away before seeing on the record, everything they had worked to build might still unravel. Mara barely slept that night. She lay awake above the flower shop, listening to rain tap against the roof, replaying every document, every conversation, every threat Robert had thrown at her. When dawn broke gray and damp, she pulled on a simple dark blazer, packed the binder of evidence her attorney had prepared, and drove toward the mediation office in downtown Portland. The conference room was sterile, lined with plain gray walls and a long wooden table. Mara sat beside her lawyer. Robert arrived minutes later with his own legal counsel, rigid and unsmiling. Lincoln entered last, taking a separate seat as a potential witness. The neutral mediator, an older woman with decades of estate dispute experience, called the session to order. Robert's attorney opened first, laying out his client's argument. He attempted to introduce the altered journal pages, only for Mara's lawyer to submit the full original notebook scans, pointing out the missing context and the signs of tampering. The mediator set the modified notes aside immediately, stating they held no credible value. Robert's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. His legal team moved on, arguing that housing and supporting Mara through her teen year justified retaining the inheritance. Mara's attorney countered with the original trust documents, Elaine's bank transfer records, and Lincoln's sworn preliminary statement. Halfway through the session, the mediator paused to check a message on her tablet. She looked up and addressed the room gently. "Mrs. Hale's care team has confirmed she is lucid enough to join remotely. We have secured a HIPAA-compliant video line if all parties agree." Robert objected sharply, arguing Elaine was too medically fragile to participate, that her judgment was compromised by medication. The mediator overruled him after reviewing confirmation from Elaine's attending physician. A moment later, a small screen on the table. Elaine appeared, propped up in her hospital bed, the oxygen tube still in place, but her gaze clear and... She spoke slowly, answering every direct question the mediator posed. She confirmed Robert had moved Mara's mother's trust funds without consent, admitted she had stayed silent out of fear for the family's reputation, and verified the authenticity of the bank documents and witness statement she had given. Her testimony was concise, unwavering, and once Elaine signed off and the video, the mediator gave both sides time to confer privately. Robert spoke with his lawyer in a tight huddle, his face red with frustration. When they returned to the table, his legal representative conceded that the evidence overwhelmingly supported Mara. After an hour of negotiating the exact payout timeline, a binding mediated agreement was drafted. Robert would release the full inheritance amount, plus accumulated interest within 30 days. No gag order, no restrictive contact clauses. The civil claim would be dismissed once the fund. Mara read every line carefully before Rob hesitated, then scrawled his signature with obvious. The court was over. She had reclaimed what belonged to her, without sacrificing her right to. As everyone packed their folders and prepared to leave, Lincoln pulled Mara aside. His number. The hospital called while we were patient. Mom's condition declined rapidly right after her video testimony. They've moved her into palliative care. Mara's throat went dry. She nodded, thanking him for standing with her, but there was no comfort to offer. She drove back to her shop, numb, and spent the rest of the afternoon arranging soft white blooms for a condolence bouquet. That night, her phone buzzed with a message from Lincoln. Elaine had passed away a few hours after mediation concluded. She had left a sealed written letter, marked Excra. Lincoln promised to drop it off at the flower shop. Mara set her phone down and walked to the front window, staring out. The legal fight was won, but victory carried a heavy cost. She had his back. Yet the woman who helped her was gone, and the fractured Hale family would end. Whatever came next, nothing could erase what had already happened. The morning sun broke through lingering gray clouds, casting thin streaks across the glass windows of Willow and Stem. Mara unlocked the shop doors, flipped on the overhead lights, and set out buckets of fresh-cut flowers before the first customer arrived. Her movements were slow, measured. The weight of Elaine's passing and the mediated settlement still hung over her thoughts. A soft knock came at the front glass shortly after 9. Lincoln stood on the sidewalk, dressed in a simple dark blazer, an off-white envelope tucked between his fingers. He stepped inside once Mara waved him in, keeping a respectful distance across the counter. "I brought the letter," he said quietly, sliding the envelope toward her. "There's nothing else. No legal paperwork, no requests, just her handwriting." Mara picked it up, running her thumb over the sealed flap. She did not open it right away. "How are you holding up?" she asked. Lincoln exhaled slowly. "Dad is shut down, angry about the settlement and Mom's choices. I'm working through the funeral arrangements. After that, I'm planning to step away from the family business for a while. I need space to figure out what I want, separate from everything the Hales built." Mara nodded. She understood the pull of breaking free from a lifetime of expectation. "We don't have to keep in touch," Lincoln continued. "I won't show up here unannounced. I won't ask for updates. If you ever need anything related to the finalized fund transfer or paperwork, you can go through our attorneys. But I'm sorry for all of it. For the years I looked away." "Thank you for telling the truth," Mara replied. It was not forgiveness, not a fresh, but an honest closing between them. Lincoln gave one small nod, then turned and left. Once the bell stopped ringing, Mara broke the seal on Elaine. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places, as if Elaine had written it while fatigued in the hospital. She read the words. Elaine apologized for her silence over theirs, for letting fear and pride override what. She wrote that the bellflowers had always reminded her of Mara, a friend she had lost too. There were no pleas for reconciliation, no demands for Mara to forgive Robert or. The final line told Mara to build a life that belonged only to her. Mara folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box on her shelf, alongside old photos. The settlement funds arrived in her bank account 3 weeks later. Her attorney confirmed the full inheritance plus interest cleared. No hidden fees, no last minutes. Many people might have taken that money and moved somewhere new, started over in another city. She invested part of the funds into renovating Willow and Stem, new display tables, an outdoor plant patio, supplies to host monthly beginner flower workshops for local. The rest she set aside in a long-term account, a safety net she had never had before. She would never again be one crisis away from losing. One afternoon, Lila stopped by the shop with 2 iced teas. They sat together on the new patio, surrounded by blooming lavender. "I was half convinced you'd pack up and disappear again when he hit," Lila said with a. I don't need more, Mara answered. Running was how I survived years ago. Now I get to keep. Their old friendship settled back into a easy rhythm, the brief rift from months prior. Late spring turned summer. Mara planted bellflower seeds in a raised bed on the patio, tending them carefully as the tiny sprouts pushed through the soil. She thought of the wilted pot Lincoln had carried into her shop all those months ago, the day her hidden world opened. That confrontation had forced her to stop hiding, to stand up for herself instead. No grand revenge. There were no scandals, no humiliating takedown. Justice come quietly, through paperwork, testimony, and agreement. Mara had reclaimed her mother's inheritance, autonomy. On a warm, calm morning, Mara knelt beside the flower bed, trimming stray weeds with a smooth. Pale purple buds were beginning to swell along the stems. She ran one finger lightly at a tight bloom, breathing in the soft scent of damp soil. The path would not be erased, but she was no longer trapped inside it. Here, in her flower shop, open sky, Mara Shaw had built a peace that no one could take away.